Okay, Milosevic's last gamble, 1995. This is again a review copy. Of a particularly hypothetical circumstance, one that I found somewhat not believable. I'm not saying that it wouldn't be possible for NATO troops to have ended up in Serbia. I even buy the idea of maybe Soviet and NATO troops both being in Serbia at the same time. Although that's a recipe for a fucking disaster. Well, I mean, there were peacekeeping troops there. But this postulates a kind of engagement that I just found really, really hard to believe. In particular, the levels of commitment, and that those levels wouldn't ramp up under the circumstances, that NATO's Air Force would be outgunned by, well, not the Soviets, the Russians, by the Russian and Serbian Air Force, that the troops would be, that the Serbian troops would be better quality than just about anything there, except for the U.S. troops. This is all very, very tough for me to swallow. And, you know, but if you buy the hypothetical, what do you have? Well, there are some interesting ideas in the game system. There's also something of a feeling of throw a lot of cool ideas in and try to make them work, and they just kind of don't. Like, this system needs more development work than it's gotten, in my opinion. In addition, there are other factors that made this troublesome from my point of view. However, again, there are some interesting factors here. So, let's look at components first. I may or may not have gotten all of them. I got more than I expected in terms of 2 maps. The maps are, and this is something this company seems to do very well, very, very nice, honestly. There were some issues with, like, the city of Nice is not on here, or if it is, it's given a name that it's not given in the rules. I would also question whether or not you want to highlight the capitals of the neutral countries quite so much. I guess if this was going to be some kind of combined map or something, that might make sense if you wanted to do a World War III map. There are issues where the TEC is not in alignment with the rules. I also had some issues as well with the way the patrol escort box is delineated, as if there's 2 different things in it, or one and something else, and then the strategic bombing has basically 3 different things, but it doesn't elevate them all to the same level. And there's an inconsistency there as well as another problem. The counters, other than so I had a couple of issues with the counters themselves. The choice to put foot unit numbers and make them almost unreadable by using outlines of numbers or something that are in colors that are not easily distinguishable from the rest of the counter was troublesome. There's like 3 different types of movement, and they're distinguished by how the font or how the printing on the movement rating is done. On foot units and airborne units, it is basically invisible. It would have been better to print them in white, in my opinion. The rulebook, very sparse, contains some inconsistencies and some other issues that I highlighted as I was working through it, like too many acronyms, stuff like that. Not enough reference calls out. If you're looking for something in one place and it's not there, you got to keep flipping through. There may or may not be a player aid included in the original game. There's no, this is one to grump about, there's no compendium indicating what you get with the game, at least in my copy. And given the amount of difficulty, every single game that I got in my order had something wrong. The Galicia, and this is the printer, the Galicia and the East Prussia both had the Galicia map instead of the East Prussia map, and they had their counters switched. Okay, all in the same set, whatever. This one came with 2 maps, and the Civil Power, the Brian Train game, came with a double set of maps as well. This one may have supposed to have had some kind of charts. There's a reference to charts being somewhere. There are some charts on here, if you want to call them that. There's the terrain effects chart, which is definitely a chart, and then there's this combat records chart. What there isn't is all the numerical charts that help you process a combat of various kinds. If those were done right, they would be fairly extensive. Because a lot of the rules are kind of just baked in that way. However, flipping through the totality of the rules was kind of painful comparatively. There may have been better formats for putting the rules together that would have worked better. The only indication of how to distinguish units and such not is this little chart here. Or a little picture here, which is way too small. It's been shrunk down to that level. So, this game borrows heavily from concepts from earlier games. It uses variable strength markers from something that later got called the variable combat system, but it used to be called Victory in the West. I think it got changed to variable combat system. Maybe I'm confusing it with something else but yeah, it was, Salerno was put out by MMP, and I think they decided to name it that. That was an intriguing system. In the first couple games in the series, it hid the strength of units so that you wouldn't know how good they actually are. You have a hint by their letter rating, and then you pull a number counter, and that gave you how strong they actually were, and then you'd have a reduced version of that on the other side. Sicily and Salerno used a different design, slightly different, one that kind of annoyed me, which was they started including, they used, you draw your number counter, but it goes away at the end of each turn, which meant you only know how good something is for a couple of days on the battlefield. My feeling with that was always, well, you could just use a bigger dice span to get the kind of randomness that you're getting by drawing the counter for what amounts to almost every battle. And it is a mechanically complex solution. This one takes that a step farther. Not only do you keep your counter only till the end of the turn, but the numerical results on the counter are less predictable. They're highly variable. Now, the game also uses 8-sided dice to really kind of randomize a comparative combat strength between the units fighting. And along with a lot of positional and circumstantial modifiers that come into play. What that ends up with is you have already a variance that runs 7 points, between a 1 and an 8 on the dice, which is fairly extreme, but also a really high variance on what's in the counters. And the counters are hard to predict. So you might pull a counter and it's better for like a C unit than it is for an A unit or something like that. And that's just kind of insane. Now, the quality of the units also contributes directly to the strength. So the actual strength number on the counter is not the only strength value that's used in the combat. It uses a pulsed and support-oriented combat system, which reminds me of a couple of Victory games. Primarily, I would say the Korean War, which I believe the other game in this series was on the Korean War. Where each unit, well, this uses a system where each unit is individually activated. And in order to get an attack to set it up, you have to move a number of units adjacent to the enemy that you plan on attacking, and then trigger an attack to get better odds. So quite often, you really have to kind of telegraph your movement. Now, in Korean War, I believe, go look it up, that you rolled a die for how many actions you got each round. And you got that many actions, and sometimes that would allow you to do an attack, and sometimes you'd piddle around somewhere else or start to set something up. But generally, you waited until you got a high enough die roll that allowed you to coordinate your attack. That worked really, really well in that game. In addition, in terms of a components issue, in that game, you dropped, I believe, counters on top of units when they were done. Which, in this game, not only are you moving each unit individually, which means every action gets a reaction. It's very hard. You can't set up a good attack without... You might get good odds because of all the variants, but you can't set up an attack that you say, yes, I know this is a good attack. In Korean War, you could set one up, and you knew you were going to win that attack. You knew you had great odds and everything. This, with the variants, you never know that you have great odds, but you can't set up your sort of optimal type of attacks in a single pulse. Instead, you move a unit into a setup position. Well, now that's threatening another piece, so your enemy can either bring reinforcements into place or they can pull out of the area that they're in danger in or whatever. I found that somewhat less satisfying and more decision thinking points of the little tiny nature that I really hate, where you're really having to think very hard about, well, can I hold it, as opposed to the estimations of those that you would make in Korean War. Now, no matter what you make as a decision in this, it's always an estimation because of the level of variance. The level of variance, I'm somebody who likes a lot of variance in my combat results, in my movement, and all kind of things. In this game, it felt like it may have gone overboard, all things told. Not just that extreme results could happen, but that they were fairly likely to happen, actually. So I found this kind of pulsed movement system that it used much less satisfactory than I saw in Korean War, and in some other games like Lee versus Grant, which also used a pulsed movement system. You would activate a given command, which meant intrinsically you had a number of units that could make a coordinated attack together. What was hard to do was to coordinate multiple commands. That could be done, but it was more expensive and more painful. In this, you have none of that. You're always moving one unit. There's one little exception to that. Once per turn, each player has a chance to make a die roll to kind of disarm a particular unit. That could give you an advantage. That's not where the edge comes. The edge comes if you fail that die roll. You might give somebody a double move. Yeah. um, um, so that was two of the big things that I really, really didn't like with it. Another game that this feels like it doesn't really borrow from, but it's trying to abstract away from, or another series, is some of the other Victory games that came out. In particular, I would say Gulf Strike, and I assume Aegean Strike uses the same system. I haven't gotten around to that yet. Which had a very, very cumbersome air missions system. You send, your air units up, you put a secret target under them, you start flying it across the map, it can get intercepted. Each air base has a certain amount of missions it can launch and planes that it can hold in it. It required a lot of planning, etc. I think this game actually does a fair job, given the scale of the terrain, the scope of the terrain covered. It does a fair job of emulating that. It doesn't cover everything that could be the case. Most particularly, interception capabilities are far too easy, in my opinion, in this. Which is to say, if somebody's flying an air mission, you can always intercept it. Maybe not in the Aegean Strike capabilities. And in particular, NATO isn't better at that. In fact, all the advantages, and I pointed this out a couple of times, are in Serbia's hands. They're more likely to win initiative, which means their air combat is better, their air capabilities are better, and more likely to get more missions. Their ground combat units have several bonuses over everything else on the board. They're just ridiculous, and they have base troop quality that is about equivalent to U.S. troop quality. Now, maybe the units are supposed to be bigger. I don't know. But whatever it is, it just doesn't feel right to me. Again, I don't really believe in the core hypothetical situation, so maybe throw into that Serbia somehow has a military and coordinates with the Russian military in a way that is better than what NATO can provide. Just no ifs, ands, and buts. And that comes to the kind of the balance question, which I think it's hard to tell because of the huge amount of variance available in the game. But I think the game is unbalanced in favor of Serbia as well. I'm not sure. I would have to play a whole bunch more. My game certainly felt that way, and I felt completely handcuffed. But sometimes games are so swingy. Another Yugoslavia game comes to mind there, Tito, that, it just looks hopeless every time you play it. But sometimes it's hopeless for one side, sometimes it's hopeless for the other. So I can't assure you of that, and I'm sure sometimes it comes out fairly even, although I never saw that with Tito. Tito always seems to be one side or the other has just this huge advantage. You have a number of different air missions available to you, but the way that the air missions are kind of pulsed is you probably only want to use a few of them. It makes sense. Some are special purpose, perhaps, whatever. Interdiction, for example, I found very, very questionable to use because it does two things. One, it can stop units that are using strategic movement from moving. Okay. Yeah, that's great. I don't know if I want to expend one of my very limited air capabilities for that, but there were times when I think I was leaving planes on the table because I couldn't figure out any attacks I could make. And I also found that airstrikes and strategic bombing. Strategic bombing is a way to collect victory points. You could actually rack up quite a few there. But the nature of the way that basically you start off, you have this capability to do an air suppression where you can knock out the opposing player's air cover, their interceptors, using your own fighters. Now you alternate placing your planes, starting with the initiative player. And if your opponent doesn't put anything in their interceptors or escort box, that means they have no offensive capability at start. But it's quite possible that their suppression fighters can convert over to those. And so you've got this weird kind of bluffing at the beginning where you roll off. Now, the units which are trying to do suppression have probably somewhere close to a 50-50 chance, depending on their quality, but whatever, of suppressing an enemy fighter from the interception box. And they also have a 50-50 chance of making it back and being able to go into their own interception box. And this leads to a weird sort of balancing act that I found wasn't entirely satisfying, but to a large part, I think, at a very, very abstract level, may have kind of addressed some of the similar kinds of operations that you see in the strike games if you play them, or for that matter in the fleet games, I guess, which uses a similar kind of system. Central America, which I did cover, uses a system that's a little bit like it, but I think that's one where each fighter only gets used once. The big deal about the strike games is that you have multiple uses based on the basing capability for each plane, but also based on the nationality of the plane, of the crew maintaining it and whatnot. In this, like with everything else, Serbia has at least a slight edge in terms of the quality of their air crews. And when you add the Russian planes in, they may actually have an air advantage. They actually seem to have a slight air advantage at the beginning of the scenario. Where that goes depends on the massive variance. Air support in combat is tremendously effective. I'm okay with that. It may be a little too powerful, but to the extent that you don't want to make an attack without air support. And you sure as hell don't want to make an attack without where the enemy has air support and you don't. But air support is a resource that you start off with, whatever kind, ground fighters, etc., and that decreases again at a variable rate depending on whether you get your recalls, on it. You could conceivably use each plane for every single action that it could possibly be used for, again and again and again throughout the turn. Or you could fail on the first chance. Now, they've got their numerical quality limitations. Initiative player gets a bonus on that. Serbians get a bonus on getting initiative. The Serbians and Russians between them have more planes than NATO starts out with, which means that when they make their choices as to where to put planes, they can delay their choices of the most important planes that they don't want to reveal the missions for, because the missions are selected by which of these boxes you put them in. This can cause some real problems. I think if you try playing around too much with the missions and try doing things other than wherever you try to do something other than the patrol escort, suppression, and ground support, you're putting yourself in a position where if you want to use that plane multiple times, you got to get it out of the box that it's in, right? And, okay, you could do airstrikes or strategic bombing and hope you get lucky and get it into the ground support box. But if you fail, it goes into the spent air, and it's not going to get used again that turn. Wherever you put it, it's stuck there until it commits to another, until it conducts that kind of mission. So if you put something in, let's see, what is it? The interdiction box. Because, hey, it's possible that somebody will do strategic movement and I want to prevent them from doing that, so I want to handcuff them with that. Or I want to cut the line of communications during a combat so they can't spend victory points to prevent themselves from taking full losses. One of the rules ambiguities was centered on this. The whole system for ground units taking losses needs to be clarified and nailed down better than it is. I tried to play as best as I could. Maybe you can spend multiple victory points, maybe you can only spend one. It's not clear. There's a lot of stuff that's not clear in that whole section. And that's one of the more innovative things in the game, is how the losses get assigned. It's just not well explained, though, unfortunately. But anyway, the choices that you make as to where you allocate your planes, that's the mission they're assigned to. You don't have that mission in mind. You just know that's what they're going to do. So like in Gulf Strike, if you want to do an interdiction type mission, and you make that decision when you see the enemy start to move, and you say, yep, put that in interdiction. I think a better solution that comes closer to that and comes closer to the reality of how air missions get allocated, which is usually not, yeah, somewhere in the next 7 days you're going to be conducting an interdiction mission. And after that, well, we'll figure out what you do after that. A much better reaction is to have this sort of, hey, you have planes available. You choose your mission, you do it. Maybe it gets recycled by the spent air, maybe it doesn't. So what I would suggest is not having these boxes. You have the spent air box, you have a fighter box, you have a bomber box. Maybe you allocate your strategic bombing and your suppression ahead of time. Still, I think you have to. That's, okay, so we have another box here. So basically we have a plane commitment for not strategic bombing, which includes everything that's in it now, and the spent air. Get rid of a couple of these boxes. And then you allocate your planes as you need them. Escorts and interceptors are put in one box, and it's all considered one thing. I'm not sure it always was because of the way that the design of the board is, where this is separated out. I almost get the feeling that, or I get the feeling that the design initially said, separate these two out. And that's the mission they're assigned to begin with. Just like these three are assigned to missions to begin with. The reason strategic bombing has to be done and allocated ahead of time is you're saying, okay, these are the things that I am committing to do before we start processing the basic cycle of the game. And the basic cycle of the game is fairly simple. It's the I move a piece, you move a piece. You move a piece until you get to the point where somebody can't move a piece anymore. Or they decide, I don't want to move any more pieces for the rest of the turn. This again feels a little bit like Korean War. In Korean War, you must always move a piece. You must always move the number of pieces you roll, or at least one. You may be able to, if you get like a low roll, you may be able to slow your process. So that was kind of disturbing. I also found that the command cycle in the game seemed again to favor the Serbians. They had better reaction. They could turn within their command cycle more quickly than NATO could. Um, the combat system or systems were relatively cumbersome. They involved me flipping through and reading and rereading rules. One of the reasons for that, yeah, let's go into this. Okay, so the way ground combat works is I'm going to attack you. I get lots of modifiers, including for supporting units and air power and terrain and all kind of stuff like that. And you get lots of modifiers for similar stuff. And then, plus the strength of the units. And then we each roll a die and add that all together. And whoever gets more causes more damage to the other person. Well, whoever gets more wins the battle, whatever that may be. The difference between those two is the amount of damage, the amount of loss points that you cause on the enemy. But for the defender, it's always the amount of loss points that they cause. Okay. Defender needs advantages. Okay, that's fine. For the attacker, it's based on the terrain. So in some terrains, and I've got a lot of nitpicking on the choices of the terrain, and the terrain that's present on the TEC does not match what's in the rulebook. Again, really need developers here. I mean, here's the thing. I think the whole system needs to be developed, but there's also this issue of a really, really common, easy errors are making their ways into these rule books or into these sets. Which one's right, which one's wrong? I don't know, flip a coin, ask the designer, whatever. I don't want to play that game in general, but you kind of have to play these. But here's the thing. There's something fundamentally... I don't feel like terrain alone determines the loss ratio, the amount of damage that this difference applies to. It has an impact, right? If I'm backed up against the river and you attack me and force me to retreat across the river, that might increase my loss point ratio, right? If I'm attacking across a terrain objective, coming over the crest, coming over the river, that might. Strangely, those don't. What does? Well, being in the mountains increases the loss ratio so that the attacker needs to accumulate a bigger difference to do damage against the defender. And if you think about it, you're like, okay, you know, rough terrain, whatever, it's harder to hurt the enemy in that. That makes some sense. But I do question whether going over a barrier isn't also. And you've already put in the modifier for the terrain in terms of they've got a defensive advantage to you coming over that's already going to change. Hey, did they even win? Why is it that it would be... Basically what you're saying is that the rough terrain, the defender has an easier time disengaging from, I think. I really do think that's what it is. I'm not sure that that's being carried through to all of its logical extremes in this. And again, you know, this is one of the more clever parts of this system, is this, or more innovative parts of this, that I haven't seen this before, which is this distinguishment between the core modifier for fighting and then the terrain effect for the defender. Oddly enough, there's nothing like terrain effects for the attacker. And I gotta tell you, if you're attacking in rough terrain, you get a bonus too. Unless you're talking about mountain passes that, you know, are ripe for ambush or something along those lines. So that kind of thing becomes somewhat disturbing to me. So for one to one is also the best result you can get, And that's sort of the core result of what the defender always gets, no matter how the attacker attacks. See, here's the thing. Attacks are sometimes undertaken with elements of terrain or weather or whatever that provide surprise that may actually reduce the casualty rate. Anyhow, something feels a little off about this combat system to me. I'm not sure what would be required to nail that down. And I'm I'm just very fuzzy on that, and kind of say, I just don't know. I just don't know. Did I mention the rulebook was really painful for me? Reading through it kind of made sense. Didn't really. I knew that I was going to have to move some pieces around and do some battles before it gelled in my head, but I found myself flipping back and forth. The terrain rules are over here on this page. They're necessary for calculating both modifiers and the multiplier for the loss points. Loss points are on the page before how to allocate them. Actual combat, much of it is summarized here, but in order to get these values, you have to flip back here to see how many movement points you used in, say, a mobile attack. And you have to flip through to the air rules to find out what the modifiers that the air units provided. Compare this to, like, when Victory Games put out its games for this. They give you a couple, 2 to 4 pages worth of player aids to, like, determine, okay. And one of them, the combat chart, would explain just about everything you need for combat. Now that's a big expense. These games are not produced with that expense. But ambitious designs might require higher production values than very, very simple designs. And, again, the development work, the production value of the rulebook, at least, they get in the way. They get in the way of being able to calculate this quickly. And if I'm missing a player aid, I hope the designer chimes in about that, because, that if it was well designed, that could make a lot of difference. I'm not sure how well designed it could be. Because part of the problem is it feels like it would be about a quarter of the rulebook on that thing. Just like Victory Games would put this kind of system in those 4 pages of a fold-out player aid, they would have all kinds of other little chrome in there that explains all kind of other stuff. But what you needed for the combat would all be present there. Sometimes painful to access, even with all that player aid, because these kinds of systems are cumbersome. In this particular case, I found a lot to be cumbersome. I found the use of these variable strength counters, just like in Sicily. If it's going to go away, screw it, man. Use better dice. Use bigger dice. Use a combat result table that gives more variance in the case of Sicily. In the case of this, use bigger dice. You get more variance that way. Because these are an obnoxious factor. You have to pick them up every turn off every unit that fought. Flipping units over to indicate that they've worked, that they've done something. All right, GBOH does that. GBOH is considered an incredibly fiddly game by a lot of people. A little bit more component support. There could be little counters that you throw on top of things to indicate that they've moved. A la what I believe Korea does. Certainly what Vietnam does. Uh, just, I also found that the thinking involved in this game, that back and forth, I move a piece, you move a piece to react to what I just did, allowed for not enough variance in sort of the pace of the operations. The operations wouldn't, they were paced, they're paced completely by something that the players have control over, which starts feeling more chess-like than I like in a game, or Go-like for that matter. Where whatever you do, I can counter it one way or another. There's never sort of this, ooh, I got the jump, I got a march on you or whatever. That may be represented in the randomness of the combat, but yeah. So I mean, there's some things in this that I think are interesting, but as is, I'm. I don't think it's a finished product. I really don't. And then there's the actual premise of the game, which I just find it, maybe it's some kind of, maybe I'm just biased and nationalistic, but man, I don't think that, I mean, if you got rid of those Soviet units and just threw the US in there, and the UK maybe, I think Serbia would have a fair chance just like that. They don't need those Soviet units. And then, especially if they call up whatever these VO reserves are, I don't know what the fuck they are, but man, that just like doubles their army or something. My impression of this, of the actual operation, was we went in there with a lot of air real hard. Serbia's air power was just gone. Now, granted, here's the one thing that Serbia needs. They need the additional air power from the Soviets to reach air parity. But their air power was close. It is close in the game. It's not way up there, but I mean, we took out, the Iraqi Air Force, which I think was significantly more powerful than Milosevic's air power. Just, I mean, it was just gone. It was total air supremacy right from the start. That doesn't feel like that would happen in this game, even if you took the Soviets out. It just does not feel like there's any capability to use this system to obtain total air superiority at all. And then all the advantages that the Serbian ground forces have on the game, I mean, I'm almost kind of tempted to see, hey, what would happen if you just took the Serbian forces and just took, say, the US and UK in addition to the Croats and, I don't know. I don't know if the Slovenians were even involved, but yeah, and see what happened, because my feeling was Serbia went hard into Bosnia. We bombed them. Their army was more or less stopped by that, and then we threw peacekeeping forces in, and the argument is kind of like, well, the peacekeepers were in a dangerous position. Yeah, that's because they're trying to do peacekeeping, in an area. They're not trying to conquer a country with, the force that appears to be being used here. Peacekeeping is a hard operation. Got the feeling that any kind of, so my impression was always any kind of set piece battle would be like, well, probably what Putin thought would happen in Ukraine. And I don't remember any evidence of any organized forces being able to stop what went in there. Of course, air superiority was achieved first, but yeah. So, I mean, this premise of the Russians seems to include like supercharging the Serbians. The Russian army sucks in the game. It's pretty crappy. It's about an equal match to the Croatian army, which again feels wrong. Should the Russian army of that time be equivalent to the Soviet army that was in Afghanistan? I don't know. I'm sure it degraded from there, but it sure the hell seems like a third-rate power in this game, as opposed to Serbia, which feels like they have an army that matches the U.S. Army. Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, even if you accept the fantasy, the actual play of the game has enough problems that, I think the system needs to be worked in some better way. And some of it is take some of the crap out. A clear example using the variable combat chits. Not a reasonable answer because the way they're used, they just become greater randomizers. Just use bigger dice. And that's the first one I'd give. Saves you on counters too. You could use counters for something else. All right, that's it. Going up.